Slightly late people. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. I pay my respects to Ngunnawal elders, past, present and emerging, and I'm the current NELA president and will be hosting the webinar this evening. Quickly, some housekeeping. As you might have just heard, we are recording this webinar, so if you object to your image being captured inadvertently, please turn off your video. We will be making the recording available via our NELA website, which will take you to the YouTube channel for registered attendees. If you have questions during the presentations, would you please pop them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen? For some Zoom browsers, it may be at the top of your screen, but you'll see a chat box there. I'll be monitoring that, and so if you have a question, please just drop it into the chat box. We aim to have time for questions, for your questions, at the end of Claire and Annette's presentations. For those who joined late, welcome. Our presenters today are going to address the topic, as you know, the challenges of regulating, investigating and managing PFAS. That is a short form for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So they will be talking about the regulation, investigation and management of PFAS, which are regarded as forever chemicals. Here is a quick profile of the speakers. Claire Smith is a partner in the law firm Clayton. She's a specialist in environment planning and climate change law. She has particular expertise in environmental, social and governance issues, resource law, contaminated land, biodiversity, water, waste and resource recovery projects, environmental litigation, and pollution incident responses. She has advised on various contaminated land matters and litigation concerning a management order. Claire was awarded the inaugural Contaminated Land Lawyer of the Year Award and was voted the Lawyers Weekly Native Title Planning and Environment Partner of the Year last year in 2020. Claire will talk about what PFAS chemicals are and how they're currently regulated in Australia. Dr. Annette Nolan, our other presenter, has more than 25 years of experience in environmental chemistry within research, analytical chemistry, remediation contracting, and environmental consulting sectors. Annette has managed major projects involving the investigation and mitigation of contaminated land and groundwater in New South Wales and Queensland. Annette also has a strong interest in innovative and sustainable remediation solutions and hazardous waste management, particularly for emerging contaminants such as PFAS, as well as heavy metals and gasworks waste. Annette has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Newcastle, following her Bachelor of Science honours. Annette will provide a technical expert's view of the basics of PFAS investigations and how they differ from other contaminants. So in your chat box, if you could direct technical questions about chemical-related issues to Annette, or you can direct them to everyone and we'll pick them up. And if you could direct the more legal regulatory type questions to Claire, they can both respond to questions, but that would probably be most efficient. So Annette is also going to talk about why the contaminated land and groundwater industry has been dominated by PFAS issues since 2015 and the key learnings that have occurred since then. So without further ado, over to you, Claire and Annette. So Claire, if you could just share your screen by clicking at the bottom of your toolbar. And then that should take you to your slides and we'll proceed through those.
Can you see those?
Not yet. So click on share screen and then open your presentation from your desktop.
Hang on a sec.
Yeah.
How about now?
Now, yes, perfect. Thanks, Claire.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I am not an expert of Zoom. I should be by now. I know we've been in lockdown. I'm in Sydney, so I've been in lockdown long enough to be an expert, but Teams is my normal online platform, so apologies for that. Thank you very much, Hannah, for the introduction this evening. I'm going to really give you, as Hannah said, a fairly high-level overview of what PFAS are and how they're regulated. I understand there's a range of different people on the call from all sorts of different walks of life, not just lawyers. So I thought it would be handy just to take a step back and talk at least initially about what they are. And then at the end, I'll give you and these are my personal observations, really as a contaminated land practitioner, working in the field and doing PFAS matters really for the last 6 or 7 years, about where I think the future trends are going. And I'm very happy to answer all your questions. I'll try and get through certainly my section as quickly as we can, so there'll be sufficient time at the end for questions. So as Hannah said, PFAS is an abbreviation for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are man-made chemicals, and they were first invented, if you like, in the 1930s and went into widespread manufacture in the 1940s. You'll know, if you've looked at any of the PFAS stuff in the US, that a company called 3M was one of the first big manufacturers of these chemicals. There are somewhere in the order of almost 5,000 different PFAS chemicals, but we in Australia, and certainly from a regulatory perspective, really only largely focus on 3. You can see on the slide there, PFOS and PFOA, that's perfluorooctane sulfonic acid and perfluorooctanoic acid. There's another one as well that Annette will talk about called perfluorohexane sulfuric acid. And one of the key things that these types of PFAS, as opposed to some of the other PFAS, have in common is they all are what's called long chain or long carbon chain. And that means that they are very persistent in the environment, which means they just are very difficult to break down. And I know that Annette will have her own observations on why PFAS has dominated the emerging contaminant discussions. Like every time I go to a technical conference, there's always something on PFAS. And you know, I've thought, well, why is that? And in some ways, PFAS has all the perfect attributes of a contaminant. It's persistent. Some PFAS compounds, so there's long chain ones, bioaccumulative, and that means they concentrate in plants, animals, and humans. And there's still uncertainty, and that's one of the reasons why it's still classified as an emerging contaminant, because there's still uncertainty as to the impacts on human health and the environment. And so regulators have adopted a precautionary approach. The other thing about PFAS, which is different to some of the other contaminants I've certainly worked on in the past, like asbestos, for example, is that it's highly mobile. And so it's very soluble in surface water and groundwater and can travel enormous distances. And that creates quite a lot of difficulty that Annette will discuss shortly, both in terms of determining where the source is, how far your investigation goes, and then how much remediation is required. Fourthly, it has been historically now since the 40s in widespread use in an enormous amount of different manufacturing global products. It I mean, I always knew that it was these long chain PFAS were used in firefighting foam, but they're used in food packaging, batteries, solar panels, non-stick coatings. So PFOS is another, one of the key. Teflon, for example, is effectively PFOS, and Scotchgard is got a large amount of PFOA in it. So it's been used in a huge amount of different ways, and that brings me to the last key attribute, which is it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and that's partly because it's been used in so many different products. And so it's common for there to be trace levels both in the urban environment and in the rural environment. Now, this map, please don't take this map as being representative. It's really just there to give you an indication of where the investigation focus has been from a jurisdictional perspective. And what you can see is that New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland have certainly done quite a lot of investigation so far in that area. In New South Wales, I know because that's where I predominantly practice, the PFAS unit of the EPA had a questionnaire that they sent out to a lot of my clients, but broadly trying to just ascertain the PFAS industries inventories in manufacturing and sort of firefighting chemicals around New South Wales, so that could then help focus their investigation. And the most common, the way when PFAS, and again, Annette's got some fantastic slides, so I don't want to steal her thunder around kind of the timeline and the knowledge both internationally and in Australia, but the first sites that were really thoroughly investigated in Australia were Commonwealth sites. They were defence bases and airports, and then from there, because of the firefighting element, New South Wales fire and rescue training facilities, rural fire service facilities have been investigated. The ports, refineries, fuel terminals, industrial manufacturing facilities are all starting to be investigated as well. So unsurprisingly, the key exposure pathway for humans is through the food that we eat and through the water that we drink. And so if you have a PFAS contaminated site, and that in some cases, may extend for tens and tens of kilometers around where the PFAS contamination originally occurred. One of the now the common things if you're doing an investigation in order to understand whether or not you're affecting sensitive receivers is to do something called biota studies, and that's as I said, becoming increasingly common, so you can see the extent to which PFAS is building up either in the fish, in the dam, or in the river close by, or in the agricultural land down the road. Now, I said before that a precautionary approach has been adopted. There are lots of laboratory studies on animals indicating that PFAS chemicals do have a significant impact. They're carcinogenic, they have impacts on reproductive endocrine systems, can affect thyroid, liver, kidney, have impacts on pancreatic issues as well. But there's still a lot more research to be done in that area. So regulation. I was talking to Hannah briefly before this webinar began, and I understand that at the national conference later this year, there will be a talk by a preeminent professor on the need for potentially a national EPA, and one of the reasons that he is advocating that is around the need for more consistent approach with contaminated land. Interestingly, PFAS is one of the, well, very few contaminants that is actually got national guidelines. And that is, as I said, because the Commonwealth sites were the first ones really to be thoroughly investigated. And because they aren't technically bound by state and territory law, there needed to be some sort of framework in place. And because these defense sites are all over the country, to regulate, and at least from a voluntary perspective. And so what happened was there was a PFAS intergovernmental agreement that was entered into, and that was published. And that is a very useful document for any of you that want to find out more about PFAS. It's very easy to read. It's not particularly technical, and it has some incredibly useful appendices in it, from things like contamination response protocols, communication and engagement guidelines. There's a national PFAS position statement, which gives the latest position from a federal government perspective based on the data around the latest impacts of PFAS. And then I think most importantly, they have attached a national environment management plan, which is just focused on PFAS. And this is, if you like, a how-to guide for the investigation and management of PFAS contamination and waste contamination. And I'll talk about that more in a minute, because it really is, you know, an important document when it comes to any kind of investigation and regulation of PFAS. The last thing from a national perspective I want to touch on is actually some federal legislation, and that's the Industrial Chemicals Environment Management Register Act, which passed Parliament earlier this year in March. And that establishes the national chemical standard. And the reason that that's important from a PFAS perspective is that it, at long last, will lead to the domestic ratification of the Stockholm Convention. And the Stockholm Convention is a really important convention for regulating, you know, very nasty, persistent organic pollutants. And PFOS has actually been listed under the Stockholm Convention since 2009. PFOA became a listed chemical in 2019. And the Stockholm Convention sets out, you know, measures to eliminate or restrict these substances in the environment, as well as waste management requirements. And while the federal government or Australia did ratify the convention in 2004, it was on an opt-in party basis. And so it's through this national chemical standard that they will eventually ratify that. And I think from what I've read anyway, these PFOS and PFOA substances should hopefully get through and be subject to the Stockholm Convention requirements by 2022. So I said I'd touch briefly on the NEPM. This document was released in 2018. It was developed by the heads of the EPAs around Australia and also in New Zealand. And it's a living document, it's an adaptive document. It's intended to change as more scientific data comes to hand. And it has already changed. So NEPM 2.0, as it's colloquially known, was published in 2020. And that was in response to sort of these 4 key areas where they felt that there was a need for more guidance or they needed to be updated. And one of those is environmental guideline values. And these are things like human health investigation levels, recreational water quality levels, ecological investigation levels. And these are really important, as Annette will tell you, because they are the triggers for site-specific risk assessments and investigations, and they also are important to look at when you're determining, how much remediation needs to be done and the endpoint. The other thing that regulators were very keen to get a consistent approach on was how PFAS contamination and waste would be stockpiled and stored and contained on site. Because what was happening was there was a lot of investigations being done, a lot of waste being generated, and there was no standard guidelines in terms of the containment cells or what they needed to do in order to store these contaminants. And now there's quite prescriptive tables in the NEPA that set out what you need to do if you're storing it from less than 48 hours, right the way through to if you're storing it or intending to store it on site for more than 5 years. There's also a detailed decision tree on soil reuse, and that's where there's very, very low levels of PFAS contamination in the soil. But this decision tree needs to be carefully gone through with the regulators, certainly on the PFAS sites I've been involved in. That's not something certainly that we've done to date. And then the last area is really about recycled water and reuse. And so as PFAS is got very low levels in the environment, it gets into the sewer system, the stormwater system, the waste management system, and there's a need really to assist water utility companies to come up with a framework at least that they could consider when they were accepting this water, treating it, and therefore then potentially sending it back out into the environment again for reuse. So as I said, while there's a national framework to encourage consistency, it's important to remember that PFAS is still ultimately regulated as pollution and contamination at a state and territory level. And I think this is where partly some of the confusion and the grey areas arise, because as a practitioner in the contaminated land space for many years, one thing I have learned is that every state and territory is slightly different, and that's certainly the case when it comes to PFAS. And so PFAS might be regulated as it is in New South Wales under specific contaminated land legislation, or it might be regulated under specific pollution laws or environment protection legislation, or it might be regulated as specifically as regulated waste under waste law. There's also what's called general environmental duties, and that's now that general environmental duty is enshrined in most state and territory environmental laws except New South Wales and Western Australia, and is a cornerstone of the new environmental law in Victoria that commenced in July this year. Now, these laws don't specifically regulate PFAS as such, they just regulate PFAS because it is a contaminant. There are, however, a couple of state laws that do specifically regulate PFAS, and that is PFAS firefighting foam. And South Australia has passed legislation to ban PFAS from firefighting foam. That took effect in 2020. I know that Queensland government has a environmental management of firefighting foam operational policy, and they have been progressively phasing out PFAS firefighting foams since 2016. I certainly have one client in Queensland where we've been doing that, and I've been involved in helping them and considering the multitude of issues associated with that. And then most recently, the New South Wales has also introduced a regulation into the pollution or amended the Protection of Environment Operations Act to ban PFAS. But and Annette will, I'm sure, say more about this. But it is very prescriptive. It applies to particular long chain PFAS. PFAS firefighting foams can still be used in the case of catastrophic fires, and so it's not a full blanket ban, if you like. And then other states and territories, for example, Tasmania and ACT, they have PFAS action plans, and then some of the state EPAs have also put out position statements that are similar to the IGA ones. So I just want to say a very few words about investigating and notifying PFAS contamination, and also a few things on management. And because PFAS is regulated under state and territory law, it is therefore that state and territory law that you need to look at to determine who is ultimately responsible for investigating it, who has the duty to notify, and who has the remediation responsibility. And while there might be an overarching polluter pays regime that does apply as well, there are all sorts of nuances in the different state and territory laws, and different enforcement mechanisms or regulatory mechanisms that can be taken in order to require either an owner, an occupier, or a polluter to do that investigation. And that can be either voluntary, through like a voluntary mechanism such as a voluntary management proposal, or mandatory through a cleanup order or notice, or so forth. There's also the duty to notify contaminants and pollutants, and that equally applies to PFAS. And as I said, this general environmental duty to do all you can that's reasonably practicable, not to harm, not to give rise to a harm human health or environmental risk from pollution or waste. And finally, the regulators have an arsenal of pollution or environmental harm offences that they can freely use if they feel they need to, if not enough is being done. So when it comes to managing and mitigating your PFAS contamination risk, what is slightly different to some more traditional contaminated site investigations is when it comes to PFAS, because it is so mobile and because of the precautionary approach that is taken, one of the first things that needs to be done is to look to see the likely risk of off-site migration, and also to look at whether there are any sensitive receivers in the near environment. I have a client at the moment, for example, that unbeknowingly bought a site that used to be a firefighting training site, and they do have quite a lot of PFAS there. The first thing they did, because they had a caretaker living on the site who was using the dam for watering his vegetable garden, was to immediately stop that, to test in the garden, and to make sure that the caretaker didn't, as a precautionary approach, use the dam until they could complete their investigations. There is as there is with all a lot of contamination remediation, this concept of reasonable and practicable measures, and that's both from a remediation perspective, and if you happen to be having a manufacturing facility, whatever, and you are still using PFAS like they do in some paper mills and have historically done. There's conceptual site models, human health and ecological risk assessments, various different remediation options for you to consider, but Annette will talk more about those. And then finally, future trends. as I said, this is just my personal experience from the sorts of matters I work on. I do a fair amount of big portfolio transactions on all sorts of things, and PFAS questions are most definitely front and center, and have been for the last few years, to be honest, in terms of a risk issue. There will be extensions to PFAS bans across other jurisdictions, either through the national chemical standard or through state law. In the US at the moment, there's a number of bills that are progressing around trying to limit and prevent PFAS in food contact packaging. So it'll be interesting to see if Australia takes a similar line to that. There will be a full review of the NEPM in 2023. And I expect there'll be a lot more around remediation and treatment technologies this time, because we'll have a lot more data. There will be some more remediation. And one of the issues is really just kind of trying to accelerate the technology to bring down the cost of the remediation. Communication and engagement, particularly to local communities that could potentially be affected by PFAS contamination, will remain critical. And there will be potentially a bit of a shift in priorities, towards wastewater treatment plants, landfills, and the liners of the landfills to determine, whether or not they're acceptable, the potential leaching of PFAS from these landfill sites, and then precinct wide projects. So where you have a lot of tenants, for example, in port areas and few terminals and airports, all of which may at some stage in the past have contributed to contamination. There are investigations going on at the moment, but there may well be precinct-wide remediation projects in the future. And then lastly, when it comes to litigation, the common law action trend that we've seen to date around the nuisance and negligence claims, the claims for property damage, and will continue and are continuing. We might also, though, get some litigation, some statutory litigation for remediation costs. So there are opportunities for innocent landowners who have got a big remediation bill to potentially pursue the polluter, either through a debt recovery action or through alternate statutory actions to try and recover their costs. There's a possibility of precinct remediation disputes as well in these ports and airports, etc. And then lastly, regulatory enforcement action. The likelihood really is that more information becomes available, more investigations are done. The risk that regulatory enforcement action will increase is likely as well. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to Annette.
Thank you very much for that, Claire. That was wonderful. We're just going to now, I'll make Claire a co-host, if I can see her on the list. Oh, sorry, Annette, I beg your pardon.
That's all right.
Okay, you're now co-host Annette, so you should be able to share your screen. And if I could just remind people, if you do have questions, could you pop them into the chat box and direct them to the appropriate presenter, please, or to everyone alternatively.
All right, hopefully
that's looking fine. Yes, that's looking
Yep.
good.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for the invitation to present tonight and for the introduction earlier. So I'm Annette Nolan. I'm a lead consultant at Ramboll based in Newcastle, just north of Sydney. And I guess, yeah, I'll be discussing leading on from, you know, quite a few issues that Claire touched on, but just expanding on those a little bit more. So whilst Claire did give us a little bit of background on what PFAS are and what their sources are, I just wanted to touch on it a little bit further and to say that, you know, PFAS is a really complex area. The chemistry of PFAS is incredibly complex. It's really challenging our industry. You know, I think it's fair to say that yeah, a lot of consultants are finding this area really challenging because it requires a bit more chemistry than perhaps they've been used to dealing with in the past. You know, the analytical chemists love it, but understanding you do need a little bit of an understanding of the chemistry. And it's just a vast amount of information that's really been accumulated, particularly over the last 6 to 7 years. So almost every slide in my presentation could be a presentation on its own, but I've aimed to just touch on some key points of interest to people attending tonight. But I have assumed, you know, a limited sort of background knowledge on this topic. So just to recap, in Australia, we only regulate 3 PFAS compounds. So 2 of those, the more commonly known ones of PFOS and PFOA, they're often referred to as the C8 compounds, and then there's the hexasulfonate, which is a C6. But there are actually thousands of PFAS compounds. Many of them are actually known as precursors. So the 3 that we regulate are incredibly stable compounds. They don't readily break down or degrade. And that's why they're called, you know, forever chemicals. However, these other thousands of precursor molecules can degrade into these stable end products over time. So I won't go any further into it than that, but yeah, it's a challenging area because you're not only considering these 3 regulated chemicals as an environmental consultant, there's the issue of precursors to assess as well, and that is a grey area, to be honest, and still sort of developing because, yeah, we don't know how quickly they'll degrade. So that people consider that's opening a can of worms if we start to worry about the precursors. But what I can recommend is if you want more information, there are a vast range of really comprehensive fact sheets that the ITRC in the US put together. I would say they're fairly technical, but even just the introduction, even just the naming and understanding the breadth of different PFAS chemicals, it could be, you know, of interest to have a look at those fact sheets. But as Claire said, the National Environment Management Plan also is a very good starting point to try and understand a little bit more about the background of PFAS. So I've got a figure here just showing, you know, the variety of different PFAS sources, but, you know, really the main initial focus was largely on those firefighting foams, and then people became more aware of these other PFAS sources as time went on. So as we know, or certainly in the consulting industry, you know, PFAS in the media headlines Started around 2015, and I'll mention sort of why that 2015 date was important on my next slide. But PFAS media headlines were initially dominated by cases related to defence sites and communities affected by contamination originating from defence sites. That led to a very, very large class action, and then another one that was announced earlier this year, another class action around the Jervis Bay area. But more recent headlines have also started popping up around the food packaging, and then a fairly recent one was around injection of PFAS into at fracking sites. So quite a variety in the media from time to time on this topic. So I've put together a timeline of sort of who knew what, where and when around PFAS, both internationally and in Australia. And this was put to, I guess it's something that became important for us in a case study that we're working on. But internationally, as Claire said, PFAS chemicals were first invented back in the 1930s. They were used for different coatings initially. Then in the 60s, the firefighting foams were manufactured and other coatings, waterproof fabrics. But it wasn't until sort of the late 1990s that early research in the US identified issues with PFAS in the environment due to its toxicity. In 2000, were the first documented where PFAS was first documented in environmental samples. And also remember that the analytical techniques had to catch up as well. So these compounds you weren't able to test for them because the analytical methods just weren't available. December, end of 2000 was when 3M reportedly discontinued PFOS production due to these concerns, and then further research in the early 2000s identified that it was toxic, persistent, and bioaccumulates. So what was the timeline in Australia around who knew what, when and where? And keep in mind also that PFAS chemicals were never manufactured here, only imported. And this is a sort of 20, I apologise, it is a little bit busy, but the slides will be provided afterwards. But here, this is a 20-year timeline of developing PFAS investigation and regulation in Australia. And it can be important to understand this chronology. For example, Ramboll is involved in a project for a case study for an insurance company, and it's been important to understand when an environmental consultant should have known to look for PFAS at a site, particularly for sites that didn't involve the firefighting foams. And you'll see on my slide I refer to AFFF. That's AFFF is the acronym for aqueous film forming foams, and that's these firefighting foams. So when was a consultant expected to know to look for PFAS, particularly if it was the contamination arose, for example, from metal plating or from a paper mill or from any of these other PFAS sources? And really, NICNAS, which is our industrial chemical notification scheme, they put out 8 alerts between 2002 and 2008. 6 of those related to PFOS and PFOA. It was in April 2003 that they put out an alert and recommended that PFOS-based foams not be used for fire training purposes. And keep in mind, we've only just started to see that be regulated in recent years. Then they also recommended PFOS and related chemicals be restricted to essential uses only. So following that, Defence started to look into this issue. There was an internal report looking at, back in 2003. Then in 2004, they made a decision to slowly phase out their most toxic foam, the 3M light water, and switch to a less toxic C6 foam called angelite. And then from 2006, they started, confidential investigations at certainly three of their sites at Williamtown, Amberley, and Oakey. In 2008, NICNAS put out they did a survey and assessed what in other industries in Australia would be likely sources of PFAS. Papers started coming out around those other sources. 2009, with the Stockholm Convention adding PFOS as a persistent organic pollutant, that certainly increased the attention around PFAS. And it also 2009 coincided with when Australian laboratories offered or could offer NADA accredited analysis of PFAS. However, that was very early days. So it wasn't till 2012 that Defence started having discussions with New South Wales EPA and Hunter Water that they had seen PFAS detected at Williamtown in offsite groundwater wells. Then guidance started to come out on PFOS and PFOA. Presentations started to appear at conferences in my industry in 2014. And then it became public in September 2015 that PFAS had been detected in some offsite groundwater wells near the Williamtown base, and that's sort of definitely when the knowledge of PFAS in environmental issues associated with PFAS really attention was certainly firmly on those contaminants from that point on. But it wasn't until sort of the next month, October 2015, that the New South Wales EPA briefed their contaminated site auditors on PFAS, but noting that the focus was still really on the AFFF and firefighting activities. That was really the focus was on those AFFF and firefighting foam. Really, from 2018, when the first version of the NEMP, PFAS NEMP, came out, certainly that's when a consultant should certainly have been aware that PFAS, to look for PFAS if there were any of these different sources likely to have impacted their site. And then, as Claire said, there'll be further updates to the PFAS NEMP as further information comes to hand. But hopefully that just gives a bit of a background on the chronology of who knew what. I guess just to touch on the firefighting foam policies that the different states have started to come out with, and particularly with New South Wales bringing theirs out earlier this year. There will be a lot of activity around this as industry has started being, I guess industries were aware that this was coming, so have already started the transition process to certainly phase out the long chain PFOS-based foams. But the Australasian Land and Groundwater Association, for instance, held a full-day symposium just in June this year. Because there's so much activity in this area, we had a full-day event with presentations on this transition away from the PFOS-based foams, ultimately perhaps to fluorine-free foams. In some states, like South Australia, they are moving to the fluorine-free foams. But really there is a lot of still some uncertainty around whether the fluorine-free foams will be effective enough on a catastrophic fire. So that's why New South Wales is still allowing for now that the PFAS-based foams, probably the C6 foams, can continue to be used on the catastrophic fires. Other states could take a different position. So be interested, watch this space for, I guess, around what happens in terms of these regulations. But it does, it's a difficult area because you're trying to find a balance, or the regulators are trying to find a balance between protecting the environment, protecting firefighter safety, but also protecting life and property for a catastrophic fire. So that's by no means an easy task. But a lot of research is happening in the US in relation to improving the effectiveness of fluorine-free foams. And particularly as the US military or US Department of Defense are looking to transition away from the PFAS-based foams. So I think that's certainly an area that will develop quickly. And these regulations are all aligned with the National PFAS Position Statement that came out in October 2019. Oh, sorry, I didn't realise I had animation. So I guess just to move on to investigation, and I suspect I am running out of time here. It really does take a multidisciplinary approach. There are so many different areas that globally, as a company, Ramboll has expertise in all these different areas, and it does, due to the complexity, it does require a multidisciplinary approach. Two areas that I had wanted to cover tonight was to touch on forensic analysis for source identification, and also about remediation, but I might have to cut the remediation side aspect a little bit short and just aim to try and cover the forensics. I don't need to say too much here, except to say that PFAS transport in the environment is characterised by their mobility, persistence, and bioaccumulation being much greater than other contaminants that we're used to. They spread like other contaminants do, but just much, much further, where plumes can be kilometres long instead of, just hundreds of, instead of metres long. They especially they spread particularly via air emissions. Whilst we don't have manufacturing facilities in Australia, this is from one of my US colleagues, we do have waste treatment facilities where air emissions could potentially be an issue. So PFAS investigation challenges include identifying PFAS sources, both on-site and off-site. What's the background water quality in the area? What's your upstream industrial sources? Are there any landfill leachate, any landfills nearby? And soil, of course, is a source of PFAS. So, where to sample and how to analyse. So really important to have, NADA accreditation and NADA accredited data, looking at your QA/QC. Your standard PFAS suite is currently 28, remembering that there are thousands of these. And should you be looking at assessing the presence of precursors? Again, that's a whole nother presentation. And remembering that there's only US standard methods for drinking water only, but not any other media. So PFAS forensics, whose PFAS is it? I guess is the topic. And, because, and as Claire alluded to, precinct-wide investigations where you've got multiple industries that could be contributing to the PFAS contamination in the area, it's not, it should be, you'd expect that to become more prevalent in the future. So because Pfas because Pfas analysis involves a suite of compounds, you can look at that data, either just simple ratio analysis or more fancy statistical tools such as principal component analysis. And that's what this figure here on the right is showing. It's showing, it's trying to, principal component analysis aims to draw out similarities and differences in a data set. And it will cluster those results in terms of that similarity. So it will cluster sources that are similar, or samples from a similar source will cluster together, and those that have a different Pfas signature will be further spread apart. So what can that help us with? It can provide, defensible lines of evidence of upstream off-site sources, source identification, and it provides a really good visual representation for, particularly when in discussions with regulators and others that will be interested in that. So what could it assist with? Ultimately, it could assist with allocation of remediation costs, monitoring remediation effectiveness independent of other contributing sources, defining your upstream background locations, defining source contribution above background, but importantly, defining practical completion for surface water cleanup. And as Claire said, the ecological guideline values for surface waters is very low. And, a client will want to know what their contribution was, so it can help define, so you're not cleaning up other sources of PFAS. So it can help define practical completion for that surface water cleanup. So we've been involved in a case study where we used where PFAS forensics was used to analyse. So we used this principal component analysis technique to help identify any upstream sources that were contributing towards the surface water contamination near the primary source. So there was a PFAS spill. Challenges involved in that project were that there was several upstream sources, potential sources. There was uncertain flow paths discharging into the waterway. Upstream background levels were found above this really low, as I mentioned, really low surface water ecological criteria, which indicated pre-existing sources and risk were present. Because of this high elevated background levels, which are actually above the current ecological criteria, that guideline value is likely to be not appropriate for the site because it's in a disturbed environment. So yeah, forensics and analysis just assisted with trying to identify whose PFAS it was, basically how much contribution came from the original spill, as opposed to what was already there in the disturbed environment. So I guess, remediation, and it may not be possible to clean up to that really low ecological criteria. However, keep in mind that that's likely to be revised in the near future. But remediation action plans should be, practical, feasible, and also incorporate sustainability principles. So ongoing investigation, analysis, and remediation costs can really escalate, particularly if no practical completion or endpoints defined. So the overall approach should be to implement mitigation and or remediation measures to reduce your source zone contamination loads and off-site migration. That they should be certainly the main overall approach. As I said, I think I will run out of time to talk too much about remediation techniques, but soil and waste treatment, certainly within the NEMP hierarchy, it's preferred that destructive treatment technologies are preferred. However, that's fine. That's certainly appropriate for high-level source zone soils, but for large volumes of low-level contaminated soil, particularly on these, large construction projects that we're hearing about, alternative approaches are going to be needed. And whilst off-site disposal to landfills may not be desirable by, certainly the community stakeholders, as an industry, though, we also don't want to be over-treating and overspending on remediation where there isn't a commensurate sort of risk associated with that treatment. So it needs a sort of holistic whole of industry and a holistic assessment of the risk profile and sustainability principles, sort of often called life cycle analysis when it comes to looking at soil remediation approaches. And then this is my last slide, but it's really just covering off that, again, there's destructive technologies, there's adsorption and separation technologies preferred. Obviously the destructive technologies are preferred, but currently, in terms of their viability and maturity, they're sort of down the bottom of the scale. But over time, we expect these there's a lot intense area of research globally around development of these technologies. So we expect that they'll move up the feasibility and maturity scale over time. But again, even for water treatment as well, it should be it should be a balance between risk, sustainability, and yes, ultimately for highly contaminated areas at high risk, destructive is preferred. And I'll leave it there. I hope we do still have time for questions if people have managed to stay around. And apologies for going a little bit over time. I'll hand back to you now, Hannah, to direct any questions.
Thank you very much, Annette. If you wouldn't mind just stop sharing your screen, and if you could just have a quick glance at the chat box. We do have several questions, some of which relate to the remediation issues that you've raised. Thank you very much for that. Both those presentations were highly informative, very rich, very stimulating, and extremely concerning in terms of the pervasiveness and the bioaccumulation and persistency attributes of these PFAS chemicals. So we have some questions. Several concern testing in the environment in relation to major road infrastructure and marine environments. Are there special, should testing be done? If it's near parks or recreational land, the marine is obviously relevant to the Jervis Bay issues that you've talked about. So, and then there was a question in relation to the remediation, which really was probably answered in your last slide about treatment options and whether they've increased. So if you wouldn't mind, Annette and Claire, could you just respond to those questions. The first one was, should major road infrastructure projects be tested for PFAS at dive sites, or at drive sites, which are in parks and other recreational areas? Should there be soil and groundwater testing? And I might just mention that Claire and Annette both very generously agreed to stay on to answer your questions. If some of you do need to leave for family responsibilities, that's fine. Just leave. We haven't lost many. I can see who's still here. We will be making the slides available. There will be a recording made available eventually. But if we could just have some time, if you would prefer to actually ask your question on video, that's also welcome. We would love to hear from you, but otherwise could Annette or Claire respond to Diane's question initially about major road infrastructure projects, and then the marine one.
I mean, that's all. Do you want me to go?
No, you go first.
I mean, as with any site investigation, it comes down to the conceptual site model, and if the soil, assessment of what nearby sources are there, and then nearby receptors is the normal the normal avenue for a contaminated site assessment. But for soil that's has to be removed because of infrastructure projects, I think, to be honest, given the how ubiquitous it is, it really, any soil is now really going to be tested for PFAS in terms of waste disposal, in terms of where the waste should end up. But the question, I think, goes on then to ask about whether it should be assessed against recreational values or industrial. It depends on it depends on the end use of the site. So it depends if the infrastructure, the zoning of the land, and the ultimate land use, which I guess sometimes is unknown. But yeah, ideally, it should be based on your conceptual site model and what your end land use is likely to be.
Yeah,
Did you want to add anything to this?
Not really. It's all about the conceptual site model, and then your point is correct. I mean, if it's dug up, it becomes a regulated waste potentially, and that's a whole different raft of regulation that then therefore needs to be considered.
So yeah, typically you do your waste screen. If it's a waste product, you'll do a waste screen, and PFAS would be part of that.
I'll just mention there's a comment from Tony Bradshaw. Tony's obviously quite knowledgeable about PFAS regulation in Queensland. He makes some points about the content of Queensland regulation. I've copied that, and I'll send that to the presenters if you don't mind, Tony, because it's more of a comment than a question.
I mean, I agree with Tony. That's all correct. That's certainly consistent with my understanding of the law. I think possibly the beginning of Annette's presentation was a little bit misleading, but I agree with all of that. And I think one of the issues in Queensland, particularly, not that I profess to be an expert in Queensland law, is the fact that PFAS is actually a regulated waste, and that there is, I think, like a very low limit, if not zero limit for very low detectable limit for PFAS waste.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just reading Tony's comment, and yeah, I guess within the NEMP, the focus is on those 3 PFAS compounds, but there are, as Claire mentioned, there are different state-based codes, end of waste codes, biosolid, the Queensland biosolid waste code, and so they will have different requirements, but yeah, certainly within, I guess that comment was mainly around the National Environmental Management Plan.
Okay, Kenny's question relates to the marine environment and the marine sampling protocol outlined in the National Assessment Guidelines for dredging. Do they still apply to PFAS, or are there specific measures that need to be undertaken? And are there any special tips for assessing PFAS in the marine environment, given the quick dispersal?
I guess the only point I would make is that you do have to keep its mobility in mind. Surface water keep in mind that the surface water pathway is very prevalent. So often people focus on the groundwater being the major pathway, but with PFAS, it's often found to be the surface water, which can then end up in the marine environment. So it all just spread. Compared to other contaminants, it is certainly likely to spread further than you expect.
Thank you, Annette. There's a question here for Claire about the regulation of Commonwealth activities on Commonwealth land by state EPAs, which raises the interjurisdictional issues. So how is the Commonwealth Department of Defence regulated by state EPAs?
Well, the short answer is it isn't. The longer answer is, from my experience, while technically defence is not regulated by the state EPAs because of the jurisdictional issue, they have adopt what's called a good neighbour principle, in the sense that where it's reasonable for them to do so, they will comply with state laws, but they're not technically bound by state laws.
And I just remind everyone who obviously are very interested in this, our national conference on the 3rd of September will have a session on the need for a National Environment Protection Authority, and Associate Professor Niven, who is at UNSW in Canberra at the ADFA learning facility, teaching facility. He's going to be speaking on the need for national EPA because of the failures to appropriately regulate PFAS. So for those who have questions, I think I encourage you to register for our conference. There will be 4 separate sessions, separate registrations if you wish, and you can certainly raise more questions at that time. There are some concerns expressed. We've known how long people have been aware of the risk. Why don't we know appropriate concentrations yet? Would Annette perhaps like to answer that one?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty still around the toxicity and the risk. It's a area that will continue to evolve. And has evolved. Internationally, guidelines have, generally drifted in the downwards direction, but potentially as a precautionary approach. But there's a lot more work being done and needs to be done around understanding their toxicity. Given there's thousands of compounds here, it's it's an area that we and I think that there is a lot more data coming out around the toxicity that it'd be interesting to see where the guidelines sort of move in the next 5 to 10 years, because it was a very precautionary approach. Will new data end up, and I can't say how it will move the guideline values in the future, but it could be that more and more data could potentially define, but the precautionary principle is I feel that it'll be interesting to see which way the guidelines move as we get more definitive data to define the toxicity and the risk more accurately. So at the moment, there's a lot of layers of precaution and conservatism built into the guideline values, because we knew so little. There was so much little known definitively around the risk and toxicity, if that makes sense. I can see a couple of questions I can answer very quickly here. So there was one around, is there any naturally occurring PFAS? No, they're all man-made, anthropogenic. Fluorochemicals are all anthropogenic. Is landfill leachate likely to contain PFAS? Yes. All landfills will no doubt be full of waste such as carpets and other materials that, textiles, all sorts of materials that contain PFAS. So yes, that's definitely likely. And have treatment options increased, and has the cost of remediation decreased? Yes, and yes is definitely the answer. There's a lot of research and development here in Australia. There's an Australian Research Council linkage grants that were awarded a few years ago that are still ongoing, and outcomes of those will come out in due course. But of course, there's a lot of research and development happening in the US and globally around continuing to develop more effective and hopefully cheaper technologies. And yes, the cost has come down. For instance, in Australia around thermal desorption, there's a few 3 facilities at least in Victoria, and the costs around the thermal desorption technologies has become quite competitive, or the pricing has become more competitive and commercially viable. So I think just off the top of my head, it's come down to around $300 per tonne, which is much lower than it was even just a few years ago to send soil, the gate fee for sending soil to these facilities in Victoria.
Thank you, Annette. There was a question from Tony, which is the possible topic of an entire webinar, and that's about the application of the precautionary principle in Australian law. If you can answer that, Claire, in 20 seconds or so. We're heading up towards 7:30, so
yeah,
people may want to leave, I think.
I'll give it my best shot, Tony, and happy to have a longer chat with you afterwards if you want to give me a call. I also noticed there's a question right at the beginning of the chat that I need to answer as well. So I personally think the precautionary principle will prevail while there's any doubt around toxicity. At the moment, we really don't know enough about how bad PFAS is for us, well, both for humans and for plants and animals. And until we get a lot more scientifically rigorous information out there that's published in leading peer-reviewed journals around that toxicity issue, I mean, I think regulators would be well within their rights to continue to adopt a precautionary approach. That's my view. I'm sure a lot of my clients wouldn't necessarily like that view, but that's I think a reasonable view. there's also a question here at the front around how are states regulating PFAS in sewage and water treatment plants, and that is a hard one as well, because it's really at the end of the day, because there isn't specific PFAS regulation for those water utilities, that's I think one of the reasons why they introduced this appendix into the NEPM, and it is a management framework around sampling and testing and procedural steps that water utilities need to go through and consider when they're receiving water through their sewage systems, where it's coming from, how they're treating that water. But at the end of the day, it comes back to what I said before, which is those utilities are regulated by the state and territory laws, and so if it's a water contaminant, they would be regulated as such. And so I know my colleagues, for example, in Queensland, have been advising a few water utilities on exactly this issue.
Okay, there's a couple more questions to everyone, so both Annette and Claire should be able to see them. Let's make these the last two. We've got 4 minutes left to 7:30, and then I think we really should close.
Oh, I was going to have a crack at the next emerging contaminant, the next dangerous emerging contaminant. There's I noticed a newsletter came out today from Eurofins. And remember, you've got to be able to analyse for these things before you can start investigating them. But there's a chemical that's released from tyres, all those stockpiles of car tyres that we see around places. And there was a study in the US that I'm a chemist and I can't remember the name of the chemical, but yeah, there's a new emerging chemical that apparently leaches out of car tyres and caused it was identified that it was causing toxicity to fish somewhere in the US, but maybe that's our next dangerous emerging contaminant. But yeah, there's a lot of research being done around pharmaceuticals and other things, but probably nothing will be as ubiquitous as PFAS would be my prediction. I think it was like a perfect storm of, it was a bit like asbestos. It was so useful and for its purpose, it was a great chemical, just like asbestos was. So we used it in so many products, and but unlike asbestos, it's mobile and moves and has ended up spreading everywhere. So I think PFAS is certainly likely to be at the top of the list in terms of just being a perfect storm of properties. Hopefully we don't do something else like that.
I would echo that. I mean, I know it's interesting that there's so much tyre recycling, and they are now encouraging tyres not to be landfilled and recycled instead. So I wonder what the impact of a recycling operation will have on that contaminant, because one of the issues that one of the most worrying things that I read on the PFAS issue is around the fact that it's used in so much food packaging, and we're talking now about recycling plastics and recycling them and combining them and using them again. And if they're for water bottles or for food containers, one of their fantastic things is they provide such a good surfactant surface that they hold the flavour or the taste or whatever in. And so, as Annette says, they've been such a useful product, but it's now actually, I think, one of the big challenges, which is potentially playing out in the US at the moment, is actually encouraging those companies that manufacture that food packaging to stop using PFAS, because there are suitable alternatives out there. I haven't really answered the question, but that's certainly one of the emerging things that I'm concerned about. I think with pharmaceuticals, I mean, I've certainly given some advice to hospitals around that thing. There's quite, you know, a lot of those really nasty class A pharmaceuticals are incinerated. So luckily they don't go directly to landfills.
Okay, look, it's 7:30, so if you don't mind, I'll exercise the chair's prerogative and close this very stimulating webinar. Thank you again, Claire and Annette. Your presentations and the time you put into it and your expertise that you've shared with everyone today is really appreciated. Thank you so much for what you've contributed and shared. It's fantastic. We will be making the slides available, as I said, and the recording in due course. So thank you everyone for attending. Enjoy your evening. Do keep your eye out on other events and have a look at the National Conference for Associate Professor Niven's presentation on PFAS and the need for a national EPA to better regulate it, and for Justice Payne's presentation again on the need for a national EPA from an intergovernmental federal state perspective. Okay, so thank you everyone. And I'll close the webinar now. So enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Hannah.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.